Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture. Today, we're talking about inclusive leadership. After going from week five's readings, where we're talking about the individuality and culture, anxiety and uncertainty, and then conflict styles, I thought there was a natural segue into understanding those concepts and then bringing them in together into what we call inclusive leadership. I'm hoping that you all enjoyed the articles this week, especially that handbook. I know it was tailored to or made for the EU, but there was a tremendous amount of information. I thought it was really helpful. Even like the activities at the ends of some of the sections there, I think are really helpful in terms of becoming and in ways of understanding how you can become a more inclusive leader. But let's go ahead and get started in the lecture. Now, one of the big things to think about, and this is in the Burke and Esposito article, is inclusive leadership does not just mean mixing a bunch of people together, right? And this idea of like just you get a good mix of people, older, younger, different races, different gender identities, different sexual orientations, just bring them all together, and that's how we create diversity, and that's how we make progress in our organization. And that's just not the case, right? Inclusive leadership is leadership that assures that all team members feel that they are treated respectfully and fairly, are valued, and sense that they belong and are confident and inspired, right? I think we all know, and the studies have shown that if people feel like they are just a number, it affects morale, which in turn affects productivity. All of this is interconnected, and when you bring in this idea, and I know I've talked about it a number of times already, but because we spend so much time with the people that we work with, I think it's crucial. I think it's crucial, and I also think everyone should be aspiring to be an inclusive leader, and to create an organization and organizational culture that values inclusive leadership and inclusivity. So, what does inclusive leadership do? So, it seeks to value the intrinsic dignity of every individual by recognizing their needs. Inclusive leaders plant seeds that will grow and lead to more inclusive actions, right? That's naturally, I think we've all been in positions where the person who is at the top, or the folks who are at the top, the way that they operate and the way that they behave, a lot of that trickles down into the way the whole organization operates. So if you have someone at the top or people at the top who are inclusive leaders, naturally that's going to trickle down into the rest of the organization and lead to more inclusive actions. Inclusive leadership can lead to an organizational culture that consistently produces results which benefit more people by embracing the diversities brought by various individuals. I know there are some folks out there who are like, look, you got hired to do a job, so just show up and do your job. And why do we have to? What is the benefit here of going out of my way to become this inclusive leader? Now, I don't think anyone in this class thinks that, because you're in this program, right? And this program is all about leadership, community engagement, and understanding that people aren't just a number. They aren't just someone who is hired to do a job. You show up and you get the job done. That everyone is connected and is a part of a team, and that progress and forward momentum and forward thinking is really what you're trying to get at. But for those folks who want to know about inclusive leadership by the numbers, teams with inclusive leaders, 17% are more likely to report that they are higher performing, 20% more likely to say that they make high quality decisions, and 29% more likely to report behaving collaboratively. And I will also include some articles. They won't be required, but I usually use them for my leadership communication course. And they talk about the fact that oftentimes when it comes to productivity, there's this misconception that if you just throw money at employees, they're going to produce better quality work or more work. And that just hasn't been the case. In fact, they have shown that there has been more benefit to making tables longer in the lunchroom, so more people can get together and more people become part of the conversation, like just the informal communication that goes on during lunch. That instead of throwing financial incentives that once a month everybody can work on whatever projects they want. It doesn't necessarily have to be what's part of, what's on the docket for their department. As long as after 24 hours, or I think it's 36 hours, your team, whoever you've been working with, has to present what you've worked on to the rest of the organization. And that has led to a bunch of bug fixes, to innovation. And so I'll share that with you because I think that just further shows the importance of inclusive leadership, where you are not having to micromanage everything that your team is doing. That's one of those benefits of inclusive leadership, is that you are letting go and putting responsibility on other people. So 6 traits of inclusive leadership. We have visible commitment, humility, awareness of bias, curiosity about others, cultural intelligence, and effective collaboration. And a lot of these things we're going to discuss when I go over some of the major concepts from the Inclusive Leadership Handbook. So inclusive leadership in action. So Burke and Esposito talk about sharing personal weaknesses, right? Showing your authentic self to your team members. They talk about learning cultural differences, and that you acknowledge team members as individuals. In that article, they also show some examples of some of the, apologize for the typos on this slide here, of least inclusive leaders, right? And some of the things that they have done. So I would, if you haven't already, I would suggest you take a look at those. But let's go into some of the concepts from the Inclusive Leadership Handbook. So there are some preconditions to enable openness and inclusions. So the acknowledgement and value of everybody's inherent worth, right? So feeling a sense of worthiness enhances an individual sense of belonging, right? And inclusive leaders should be trying to stimulate that sense of belonging, right? We should be doing whatever we can to make sure people feel that they are welcome. Not only that they are welcome, but that they are an essential part of our team, that they belong, that they are a family in that organization. An approach based on human rights. Essentially, regardless of your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your race, your religion, whatever it is, it may be, that you as an individual, everyone a part of your organization is equally entitled to human rights. That should be from the very get-go, as an inclusive leader, part of what you believe and what you enact in your organization. Awareness of interconnection. I think this one's big because I think essentially an inclusive leader considers the effects produced by their own actions, by an organization's actions, and they want to understand what happens when they experience things in terms of like a system instead of just looking at their only one viewpoint, right? Understanding that whatever decisions and actions you take as a leader will then affect your team, will then affect your organization, and then will affect all stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I don't just mean people on a board. I'm talking about anybody with any type of, that will feel any kind of ramification or effect based on those actions of that organization. And an inclusive leader is aware of those interconnections. The role of power in inclusive leadership, right? And they talk about the 3 types of power, right? The power within, right? That comes from your own self-worth, your self-knowledge. They talk about the power over, right? So understanding that with your formal authority, with your position, through money, through whatever power that you may have, you have essentially power over other people in your organization. And there might be some people who have power over you. But more importantly, inclusive leaders understand the power with, right? Finding common ground among different interests, right? That collective strength of the people working together with one another. The power with is incredibly powerful and essential, and should be something that inclusive leaders strive for. Focusing on that power with and not power over, or power within. I mean, of course, it's essential for a leadership to have that power within and to acknowledge that power over people, right? Because essentially, you oftentimes you will be the person making that final decision, but really understanding the power of that power with. And lastly, courage to share and take over responsibility. Everybody takes responsibility for inclusion, right? As an inclusive leader, that's the goal, is that you are leading using inclusivity and then sharing that with other people. And that also means you need to be courageous enough to, one, make the difficult decisions when you need to, but also understanding that as a leader, sometimes the courage means that you are willing to let go and let other people make those decisions or take those actions because you trust them and understand that they belong in the organization, and they belong because they're qualified and they're skilled to make decisions and make the right actions and make the right calls, and you can allow them to do that because they're all part of a team and you're all working towards those same goals. So that being said, inclusive leaders practice self-awareness, right? Being authentic and understanding who you are, right? Let go of who you're supposed to be and embrace who you are, right? That's essential for being an inclusive leader. Live a shared vision. Sorry. Inclusive leaders question the current reality, and that's the that should be from the get something you understand about inclusive leadership, is that I think there's a lot of folks who come across the idea of inclusive leadership and decide this is what I want to do, and the first step is acknowledging that change needs to happen. And when you make that acknowledgement, you have to understand, okay, what is the current reality that we're living in, right? What is the status quo? Because only until we understand that can we then create this shared vision of what progress and change will look like, right? So it requires courage to implement this vision for change and the courage to allow others to be a part of this shared vision. Build relationships, right? So if you think back a few weeks with Dr. De Los Santos Upton, and we were talking about Nepantla, and we're talking about coalition building, like that is a prime example of building relationships as an inclusive leader, right? Understanding that every relationship and the worth of every individual on your team and everyone that has something at stake, building those relationships is critical to the success of the organization and the success of reaching the goals that you are creating as a team, right? That shared vision is only obtainable if you have built relationships that allow it to happen. And lastly, you create change, because that's essentially the key of leadership, which in turn is a key to inclusive leadership. So it's not necessarily just about, as a leader, providing direction, but it may be just informing people of what's going on, supporting people in whatever it is that they're doing. But you need to share the responsibility. It is not just your own responsibility as a leader to make that change happen. As an inclusive leader, you understand that you are just one small part in that movement of making progress and creating change, looking at the bigger picture in the world, and trying to be the active force in driving change for a better future, right? So going back, understanding that there is a current reality that is not sufficient. It's just not working. And working together and creating change with your team. So that's inclusive leadership. I really encourage, if you've just had a time to kind of just browse through the inclusive leadership handbook, I really encourage you all to take the time, go through it, and save it. I think there have been plenty of times where even in my position where I think, how can I be a more inclusive leader? What could I be doing? Because I think in terms of being an inclusive leader, one thing that I'm sure you've come to understand is that you're always a work in progress, right? You're going to stumble, you're going to fail. There are going to be some times where you slip up, and it is your responsibility to then take those moments and learn from them, right? Learn from your team. You should be learning from them as much as they're learning from you, and that's part of being an inclusive leader. So I highly suggest you take a look at that handbook a little more closely if you haven't already. But that is this week's lecture on inclusive leadership.